Standing in the rain outside the glass doors of Nexus Digital Solutions, watching the security guard shake his head apologetically while my business partner Tyler Camden smirked from behind the reception desk, I realized that some betrayals are so perfectly orchestrated, they almost deserve applause. Almost. What Tyler didn't know, as he savored his moment of triumph, was that I wasn't just Sarah Martinez, co-founder and creative director of the company we'd built together over 5 years. I was also Sophia Reyes, the silent property investor who owned the entire 30-story Meridian Tower that housed not only our offices but also the headquarters of 6 other major tech companies whose lease payments funded my very comfortable lifestyle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful. Tyler thought he was locking me out of my own company. Instead, he was about to discover that he'd just declared war on his landlord. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in downtown Seattle. I'd arrived at our offices on the 15th floor of Meridian Tower at 7:30, carrying my usual lavender latte from the coffee shop in the lobby and reviewing the presentation deck for our biggest client pitch of the year. Pacific Northwest Bank had approached us 6 months ago about redesigning their entire digital ecosystem, a project worth $2.8 million that would establish Nexus Digital as one of the premier design agencies on the West Coast. Tyler was already at his desk when I walked in, which should have been my first warning sign. In 5 years of partnership, Tyler Camden had never arrived before 9 o'clock, unless there was a crisis or an opportunity that excited him beyond reason. He looked up from his laptop with a smile that seemed perfectly normal at the time but would later replay in my memory as predatory. "Good morning, sunshine," he said, using the nickname that had started as affection but recently felt more like condescension. "Ready to change our lives today?" The Pacific Northwest pitch was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon, and we'd spent weeks perfecting every detail. Our proposal included a complete brand refresh, mobile app development, and a customer portal system that would revolutionize how the bank's clients manage their finances. More importantly, landing this contract would allow us to expand into the enterprise market and hire the additional developers we desperately needed. "I've been thinking about the presentation structure," I said, settling into my desk chair and opening the files we'd collaborated on for months. "Maybe we should emphasize the security features more heavily. Banks are paranoid about data protection, and our encryption protocols are actually more advanced than what most financial institutions use internally." Tyler's smile widened in a way that made my stomach clench with unease I couldn't quite identify. "Actually, Sarah, I've made some revisions to the pitch. I think you're going to love the new direction." He turned his laptop screen toward me, and I felt the world tilt sideways as I saw our presentation completely transformed. The Nexus Digital logo had been replaced with something called Camden Innovations. My design concepts were still there. My months of research and development work, my innovative solutions for the banking industry's digital challenges, but my name had been systematically removed from every slide. Where our joint bio page had once described Sarah Martinez and Tyler Camden as co-founders and creative partners, now it simply featured Tyler Camden, founder and CEO of Camden Innovations, with a brief mention of various talented contractors who had contributed to the project development. "What is this?" I asked, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to my own ears. Tyler leaned back in his ergonomic chair, his expression shifting from fake friendliness to something approaching pity. "Sarah, we need to talk. This partnership has run its course, and frankly, I think we both know you've been holding the company back." The words hit me like a physical blow. Holding the company back. I was the one who had designed every major project that had established our reputation. I was the one who had developed the proprietary software tools that gave us our competitive advantage. I was the one who had cultivated relationships with the clients who provided 90% of our revenue. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully, trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure while my world collapsed around me. Tyler stood and walked to the window overlooking Elliott Bay, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose I recognized as his intimidation stance. "The tech industry is evolving, Sarah. Clients want to work with visionaries, with leaders who can scale their thinking beyond pretty pictures and color palettes. You're talented, don't get me wrong, but you're fundamentally a designer, not a business strategist. Camden Innovations needs to position itself for enterprise-level growth, and that requires a different kind of leadership. Pretty pictures and color palettes. 5 years of partnership reduced to a dismissive phrase that completely ignored the fact that I had been the strategic brain behind every successful project we'd ever completed. I thought about the late nights I'd spent analyzing user behavior data, the weekends I'd dedicated to learning new programming languages, the countless hours I'd invested in understanding not just how to make things beautiful, but how to make them functionally superior. Tyler, this is insane, I said, standing to face him directly. We built this company together. Half of everything here belongs to me, including the intellectual property you're trying to steal. His laugh was cold and calculating, nothing like the warm humor I'd once found charming during our college years at the University of Washington. Actually, Sarah, you might want to review your employment contract more carefully. When we incorporated Nexus Digital, you signed an agreement that classified you as a creative contractor rather than a full business partner. I own 65% of the company assets, including all intellectual property developed using company resources. You own 35% of a creative services contract that I can terminate with 30 days' notice. The room started spinning as I processed what he was telling me. I grabbed my desk chair for support, my mind racing through memories of signing incorporation papers that Tyler had assured me were standard formalities. I'd trusted him completely, never questioning the legal documents he placed in front of me, because we were partners, friends, collaborators, building something meaningful together. You can't do this, I whispered, but even as I said the words, I knew he could. Tyler had studied business law before switching to computer science, and he'd always handled the administrative aspects of our partnership, while I focused on the creative and technical work. I'd been naive enough to believe that trust and friendship were sufficient protection against betrayal. I'm giving you a choice, Sarah, Tyler continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone offering a generous concession. You can accept a transition package that includes 3 months severance and a positive reference letter, or you can fight this in court and lose everything while accumulating legal fees that will destroy your financial future. The Pacific Northwest Bank contract alone will generate enough revenue to sustain Camden Innovations for the next 2 years. I don't need a partner anymore, especially one who doesn't understand the difference between artistic vision and business reality. I thought about the years we'd spent building our reputation, the clients who trusted me personally, the innovative solutions I'd developed that were now being stolen along with my company. But more than anything, I thought about the secret Tyler didn't know, the ace I'd been holding for 3 years without ever imagining I'd need to play it. Fine, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. I'll clean out my desk and be gone by the end of the day. Tyler's expression shifted to surprise and then satisfaction. He'd clearly expected more of a fight, and my apparent capitulation made him feel generous in his victory. I think that's the mature decision, Sarah. You're talented enough to land on your feet, and this way we can both move forward without unnecessary drama. I spent the next hour methodically packing my personal belongings, while Tyler made phone calls to clients, explaining that Nexus Digital was rebranding as Camden Innovations, and that I had decided to pursue other opportunities. Each conversation felt like another knife twist, listening to him rewrite our history while positioning himself as the sole architect of our success. The most painful call was to Rebecca Thompson at Cascade Marketing, a client who had specifically requested to work with me on 3 separate projects over the past 2 years. Sarah decided it was time to explore new creative challenges, Tyler explained smoothly. But don't worry, the same innovative approach and attention to detail will continue under the Camden Innovations brand. When I finished packing, Tyler walked me to the elevator with the kind of professional courtesy usually reserved for fired employees and departing vendors. It's been a great run, Sarah. I genuinely hope you find something that's a better fit for your skill set. The elevator doors closed between us, and I saw him return to our former office with the satisfied stride of someone who had just executed a perfect business maneuver. But as I walked through the elegant lobby of Meridian Tower, past the marble columns and crystal chandeliers that I'd admired every day for 3 years, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number that Tyler Camden had never seen me use. Marcus Rivera answered on the second ring. Rivera Property Management, this is Marcus. Hi Marcus, this is Sophia Reyes. I need you to schedule an emergency meeting with the building management team for this afternoon. It's time to discuss some changes to the lease agreements for our 15th floor tenant. There was a brief pause as Marcus processed the unusual request. Of course, Miss Reyes. Should I prepare the standard termination paperwork? Or are we looking at lease modifications? Let's start with a complete review of their occupancy terms, I said, watching the rain streak down the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows. I have a feeling we're going to discover some very interesting violations of their rental agreement. The story of how Sarah Martinez became Sofia Reyes, secret real estate investor, began 4 years earlier with a lottery ticket purchased during the darkest period of my life. My father, David Martinez, had just passed away from complications related to diabetes, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt and a small house in Ballard that barely covered his funeral expenses. I was 26 years old, working 16-hour days trying to establish Nexus Digital, while grieving the loss of the man who had taught me that creativity and determination could overcome any obstacle. The Mega Millions jackpot that October had reached a record-breaking $470 million, and in a moment of desperate hope, I'd spent $20 on lottery tickets at the convenience store near my apartment. When 5 of my 6 numbers matched, winning me $2.8 million, it felt less like luck and more like a message from my father, who had always believed that hard work would eventually be rewarded by the universe. But instead of celebrating publicly or making impulsive purchases, I'd done something that surprised even me. I'd consulted with a financial advisor who specialized in helping lottery winners avoid the common pitfalls that destroyed so many sudden fortunes. Her advice was simple but profound. Invest the money in income-generating assets that could provide long-term security without attracting attention or changing my fundamental lifestyle. Real estate, she explained, particularly commercial properties in growing tech markets, offered the perfect combination of steady income and appreciation potential. Seattle's downtown core was experiencing unprecedented growth, with technology companies driving demand for premium office space that far exceeded available supply. A young investor with cash could acquire properties that would generate substantial rental income while appreciating in value as the market continued expanding. I'd spent 3 months researching commercial real estate opportunities before discovering that Meridian Tower, the building where Tyler and I had just signed a lease for our expanding company, was being sold by an investment group that needed to liquidate quickly due to partnership disputes. The asking price was $2.6 million for a 30-story building in the heart of Seattle's financial district, with existing tenants that generated over $400,000 in monthly rental income. The decision to purchase the building under an assumed identity was partly practical and partly emotional. Sofia Reyes was my mother's maiden name, and creating a separate business identity allowed me to keep my real estate investments completely separate from my work at Nexus Digital. More importantly, it gave me the freedom to build wealth without affecting my professional relationships or attracting unwanted attention from people who might treat me differently if they knew about my financial resources. Marcus Rivera, the property management company I'd hired to handle day-to-day operations, was one of only 3 people who knew that Sofia Reyes was actually Sarah Martinez. The elaborate system of shell companies and trusts we'd established ensured that my ownership remained completely confidential, while providing legal protection and tax advantages that maximized the investment's profitability. For 3 years, I'd walked into my office every morning as Sarah Martinez, creative director and co-founder of Nexus Digital, while secretly being Sofia Reyes, the landlord who owned not just our office space but the entire building that housed 6 other major tenants. The monthly rental income from Meridian Tower was more than enough to cover my modest lifestyle, while allowing me to reinvest in additional properties throughout Seattle's growing tech corridor. The irony of paying rent to myself had always amused me, but I'd never imagined that my secret identity would become the weapon I needed to destroy someone who had betrayed me so completely. Tyler thought he was stealing my company and my livelihood. Instead, he was about to discover that he'd just declared war on someone with resources and power he couldn't begin to comprehend. The emergency meeting with the building management team took place in the conference room on the 31st floor, a space I'd visited dozens of times as Sofia Reyes but never as Sarah Martinez. Marcus Rivera had assembled the key personnel who handled operations for Meridian Tower, including the head of security, the facilities manager, and the legal counsel who reviewed all tenant agreements. Ms. Reyes, Marcus began, his tone professional but concerned. You mentioned potential lease violations for our 15th floor tenant. Can you provide some context for what we're investigating? I opened the folder containing Nexus Digital's rental agreement, a document I'd reviewed carefully that morning for the first time since we'd signed it 3 years earlier. Camden Innovations, formerly Nexus Digital Solutions, appears to be operating outside the parameters of their original lease agreement, I explained. The rental contract specifically states that the space is licensed for a partnership between Tyler Camden and Sarah Martinez, with both parties required to maintain active involvement in the business operations conducted on the premises. The legal counsel, Patricia Wong, leaned forward with interest. Are you saying that one of the named partners is no longer involved with the business? According to my sources, Sarah Martinez was terminated from her position today, which fundamentally alters the nature of the business entity that signed the lease agreement. Tyler Camden is now operating as a sole proprietor under a different company name, which constitutes a material breach of the original contract terms. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the implications. The lease specifically requires both partners to be actively involved, because that was the basis for approving their application.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
A startup partnership has different risk profiles than a sole proprietorship, especially when the remaining partner has significantly less experience and a weaker financial background. It gets worse, I continued, pulling out printed copies of Tyler's recent communications with our clients. Camden Innovations is representing itself as the successor to Nexus Digital, without proper notification to the building management or approval for the business name change. They're also using intellectual property that may not be legally transferred under the terms of Sarah Martinez's employment agreement. Patricia Wong's expression grew serious as she reviewed the documentation. This is definitely a material breach of lease terms. The question is how you want to proceed, Ms. Reyes. We can demand immediate cure of the violations, impose financial penalties, or move directly to termination proceedings. I thought about Tyler sitting in our former office, probably celebrating his business victory while planning how to spend the money from the Pacific Northwest Bank contract he'd stolen from me. I imagined him calling colleagues and competitors to boast about his strategic move, positioning himself as a visionary entrepreneur who'd finally shed the dead weight that was holding back his company's growth. Let's start with a formal notice of lease violation, I said. Give Camden Innovations 72 hours to cure all breaches, including restoring Sarah Martinez to her position as co-founder and reverting to the original business structure. If they fail to comply, we move to immediate termination with forfeiture of all deposits and prepaid rent. The head of security, David Kim, raised a practical concern. Ms. Reyes, if we're moving to termination proceedings, we should be prepared for potential resistance. Business owners facing eviction sometimes become desperate and unpredictable. I smiled, thinking about Tyler's shock when he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. I don't think Camden Innovations will resist once they understand their situation, I replied. Sometimes the best education comes from discovering how little power you actually have. The meeting concluded with assignments for each team member. Patricia would draft the legal notices and violation documentation. Marcus would coordinate with building security to ensure proper service of the notices. David would prepare for potential access restrictions if the situation escalated to eviction proceedings. As we prepared to adjourn, Marcus asked the question I'd been expecting. Ms. Reyes, this seems like an unusually personal interest in one tenant's lease violations. Is there something else we should know about this situation? I looked around the conference room at the team of professionals who had helped me manage my property investments for 3 years. People who had earned my trust through consistent competence and discretion. Tyler Camden made a serious error in judgment today, I explained carefully. He assumed that Sarah Martinez was powerless to respond to his betrayal because he controlled the company they built together. What he doesn't realize is that some people have resources and connections that extend far beyond his limited understanding of the business world. Marcus nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who was beginning to understand the true scope of what we were dealing with. In that case, Ms. Reyes, I think Camden Innovations is about to receive a very expensive education in the importance of treating business partners with respect. By 6 o'clock that evening, Tyler Camden's world was about to change forever, and he still had no idea what was coming. I drove home to my Queen Anne apartment with the windows down, letting the cool Seattle evening air wash away the stress and anger of the morning's betrayal. Tomorrow would bring the first phase of Tyler's education in the consequences of underestimating people, but tonight I had preparations to make. The legal paperwork Patricia Wong had prepared was comprehensive and devastating. Tyler would receive formal notice that Camden Innovations was in material breach of their lease agreement for multiple violations, operating under an unauthorized business name, fundamentally altering the partnership structure that formed the basis of their tenancy approval, and conducting business activities that deviated from their original application. The cure period of 72 hours was technically generous but practically impossible, since Tyler couldn't restore me to my position without admitting his theft of intellectual property and fraud in client communications. More importantly, the notice would be delivered by building security at 9 o'clock the next morning, ensuring that Tyler would receive it in front of whatever employees, clients, or colleagues happened to be present. His moment of professional triumph would be immediately followed by a public demonstration of how quickly business success could transform into legal vulnerability. But the lease violation was just the opening move in a much larger game. Over the past 3 years, Sophia Reyes had developed relationships with property managers, business leaders, and legal professionals throughout Seattle's commercial real estate market. Tyler's reputation as an untrustworthy partner would spread through the business community with the efficiency of a computer virus, making it nearly impossible for him to secure office space, credit arrangements, or professional partnerships in the future. The Pacific Northwest Bank contract that Tyler thought he'd stolen would become his biggest liability, rather than his greatest asset. Once the bank's executives learned that Camden Innovations was facing eviction for fraudulent business practices, they would immediately terminate the agreement to protect their own reputation. No financial institution could afford to be associated with a company under investigation for intellectual property theft and breach of contract. As I prepared for bed in my modest one-bedroom apartment, the same space I'd lived in for 5 years despite having the resources to afford something much more luxurious, I reflected on the strange paths that life sometimes takes. This morning, I'd been Sarah Martinez, betrayed business partner facing financial ruin and professional humiliation. Tonight I was Sophia Reyes, real estate investor with the power to destroy the man who tried to steal my life's work. Tyler Camden thought he was a brilliant strategist who'd outmaneuvered a naive creative partner. Tomorrow he would discover that he'd actually picked a fight with someone who owned the ground he stood on, both literally and figuratively. Some lessons in humility are expensive, and Tyler was about to enroll in a masterclass that would cost him everything he thought he'd won. The rain continued falling against my apartment windows as I set my alarm for 6:30 the next morning. I wanted to be in the Meridian Tower lobby when Tyler arrived for what would probably be his last day as CEO of Camden Innovations. After all, as both his former partner and his landlord, I had front row seats to watch justice unfold in the most poetic way possible. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's simply being in a position to let people destroy themselves while you watch from a safe distance, holding all the power they never knew you had. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only follows Seattle's heaviest rainstorms. I positioned myself in the lobby of Meridian Tower at 8:45, nursing a cappuccino from the ground floor cafe while pretending to read emails on my laptop. The marble floors gleamed under the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the usual flow of professionals hurried past me toward the elevator banks, completely unaware that they were about to witness a masterclass in corporate justice. Tyler arrived at exactly 9:03, striding through the revolving doors with the confident swagger of someone who believed he'd successfully executed the perfect business coup. He wore his charcoal gray suit, the expensive one he'd purchased last month to celebrate what he'd called our upcoming breakthrough year, and carried the leather briefcase I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago. The irony of him using my gift to carry documents related to stealing my company wasn't lost on me, but it was about to become the least of his problems. David Kim, the head of building security, emerged from behind the reception desk with military precision, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as he approached Tyler near the elevator bank. The morning rush of tenants slowed as people sensed something unusual happening in their typically routine environment. "Excuse me, sir," David said, his voice carrying the kind of professional authority that immediately commanded attention. "Are you Tyler Camden, of Camden Innovations?" Tyler turned with a puzzled expression, clearly not recognizing David despite having passed him in the lobby hundreds of times over the past 3 years. "Yes, I'm Tyler Camden. Is there a problem with the elevators?" David produced a manila envelope with the kind of ceremonial formality usually reserved for serving legal documents. "Mr. Camden, I'm delivering official notice from building management regarding significant violations of your lease agreement. Please ensure that all named parties in your organization receive copies of this documentation within 24 hours. The lobby fell silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Tyler accepted the envelope with trembling hands, his face cycling through confusion, concern, and growing alarm as he processed what was happening. "I don't understand," Tyler said, his voice higher than usual. "What kind of violations? We've been model tenants for 3 years. Our rent is always paid on time, we've never had noise complaints, and we maintain our space immaculately." David's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "The violations are detailed in the documentation, sir. You have 72 hours to cure all breaches or face immediate termination of your lease agreement. I recommend consulting with legal counsel as soon as possible." Tyler tore open the envelope with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the legal document that Patricia Wong had crafted with surgical precision. I watched his face transform from confusion to horror as he read the specific accusations. Operating under an unauthorized business name, fundamentally altering the partnership structure that formed the basis of lease approval, conducting business activities that deviated from the original application, and engaging in potentially fraudulent misrepresentation of company ownership. "This is impossible," Tyler whispered, though his voice carried clearly in the silent lobby. "Sarah Martinez was a contractor, not a partner. The lease agreement reflects the actual business structure. I have documentation proving my majority ownership of all company assets." David remained unmoved by Tyler's protests. "Sir, the lease agreement clearly states that both Tyler Camden and Sarah Martinez must maintain active involvement in the business operations conducted on the premises. Building management has received credible information that Ms. Martinez was terminated yesterday, which constitutes a material breach of the partnership requirement." Several people in the lobby had stopped pretending to mind their own business and were openly watching the confrontation unfold. I recognized faces from other companies in the building, professionals who would undoubtedly share this story throughout Seattle's tight-knit business community before the morning was over. Tyler's voice cracked as he tried to maintain composure. "There must be some misunderstanding. I can provide employment contracts and incorporation documents that clearly establish the proper business structure. This is obviously a mistake that can be resolved quickly. The building management company has reviewed all relevant documentation," David replied. "If you believe there are factual errors in our assessment, you're welcome to present contrary evidence to our legal department. However, the 72-hour cure period remains in effect regardless of any disputes about the underlying facts." Tyler stuffed the legal documents back into the envelope, his hands shaking with what I recognized as barely controlled panic. "Who initiated this review?" he demanded. "Someone must have filed a complaint or provided false information about our business operations. I want to know who's behind this harassment." David's smile was professionally polite, but offered no comfort. Building management conducts periodic reviews of all tenant compliance with lease terms. Any specific questions about our investigation procedures should be directed to our legal counsel, whose contact information is included in your documentation. As Tyler hurried toward the elevators, clutching the envelope like evidence of his own execution, I felt a surge of satisfaction that was both sweet and slightly unsettling. The man who had stolen my life's work was learning his first lesson in the consequences of underestimating people, but this was only the beginning of his education. I finished my cappuccino slowly, savoring both the perfectly balanced espresso and the perfect execution of Phase 1. By the time I left the lobby, Tyler would be upstairs frantically making phone calls to lawyers, accountants, and anyone else who might help him understand how his moment of triumph had so quickly transformed into a legal nightmare. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt different today, knowing that I was visiting my own property as Sophia Reyes, rather than simply going to work as Sarah Martinez. When the doors opened, I could hear Tyler's voice echoing down the hallway from our former office. his tone urgent and desperate as he spoke to someone on the phone. I need to understand the legal implications of partnership dissolution on commercial lease agreements, he was saying as I walked past the glass doors of what was now Camden Innovations. If one partner is terminated for cause, does that automatically breach the lease terms? What do you mean it depends on the specific language of the agreement? Our former receptionist, Amanda Wells, looked up from her desk with obvious confusion and concern. Sarah, what are you doing here? Tyler said you'd decided to pursue other opportunities, but this doesn't seem like a normal transition. I smiled at Amanda, who had always been kind and professional despite having to navigate the increasingly tense atmosphere between Tyler and me over the past few months. Hi, Amanda. I'm just here to collect a few personal items I forgot yesterday. How are things going this morning? Amanda glanced toward Tyler's office, where his voice was growing more agitated by the minute. Honestly, Sarah, I think something serious is happening. Tyler received some kind of legal document in the lobby, and he's been making frantic phone calls ever since. He mentioned something about lease violations and partnership requirements. Do you know anything about that? The question was innocent enough, but it presented an interesting opportunity to plant seeds of doubt about Tyler's version of recent events. I lowered my voice conspiratorially, ensuring that Amanda would feel like she was receiving privileged information. Amanda, I need to be careful about what I say because there are legal implications, but Tyler's story about me leaving voluntarily isn't entirely accurate. There were some disagreements about company direction and intellectual property ownership that haven't been resolved. I'm consulting with attorneys about my options. Amanda's eyes widened with understanding and sympathy. I knew something didn't add up. You built half the systems we use here, and Tyler's been telling clients that he developed everything himself. That never made sense to me, especially since I've watched you work on those projects for years. Just then, Tyler's voice rose to a level that carried clearly down the hallway. What do you mean Sarah Martinez is listed as an equal partner in the lease documentation? I have incorporation papers that clearly establish my majority ownership. This is insane. Someone is obviously providing false information to the building management company. Amanda and I exchanged meaningful glances. The panic in Tyler's voice was becoming impossible to ignore, and it was clear that his carefully constructed narrative about company ownership was beginning to unravel under legal scrutiny. Sarah, Amanda said quietly, I don't know what's really going on here, but I want you to know that most of the staff has always seen you as the creative genius behind our best projects. If Tyler is trying to take credit for your work, that's not right, and people will remember the truth regardless of what legal documents say. Her loyalty touched me more than I'd expected. Amanda had been with us for 2 years, watching our partnership evolve from collaborative excitement to professional tension, and her instincts about the real dynamics were apparently more accurate than Tyler had realized. Thank you, Amanda. That means more to me than you know. Just remember that sometimes the truth takes a while to emerge, but it usually does eventually. I gathered the few personal items I'd actually forgotten, mainly a small succulent plant and a framed photo of my father, and prepared to leave before Tyler realized I was in the building. But as I waited for the elevator, Tyler's office door burst open, and he emerged, looking like a man who'd just received devastating medical test results. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, his expensive suit was wrinkled from stress, and his face had the pale, sweaty appearance of someone fighting nausea. Sarah, he called out, his voice cracking with desperation. Thank God you're here. We need to talk immediately. There's been some kind of massive misunderstanding with the building management company, and I need your help to straighten it out. I turned slowly, making sure my expression conveyed mild curiosity rather than the satisfaction I was actually feeling. What kind of misunderstanding, Tyler? Yesterday you made it very clear that our professional relationship was over, and that I had no stake in the company's future. Tyler rushed toward me, his usual composed demeanor completely abandoned. The building management company is claiming that our lease requires both of us to remain actively involved in the business. They're saying that terminating your position constitutes a material breach of the rental agreement. This is completely insane, but they're threatening eviction if we don't cure the alleged violations within 72 hours. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside while Tyler remained in the hallway, too agitated to move. That does sound complicated, Tyler. Have you consulted with a lawyer about your options? I've been on the phone with 3 different attorneys this morning, and they're all telling me that commercial lease agreements can include partnership stability requirements. Apparently, some landlords view startup partnerships as higher risk than established sole proprietorships, so they include clauses that protect against sudden business structure changes. The elevator doors began to close, and Tyler stepped forward as if to join me, but I held up my hand to stop him. Tyler, I'm sure you'll figure out a solution. You made it very clear yesterday that you don't need a partner, so I'm confident you can handle this independently. Good luck with everything. The doors closed on Tyler's panicked expression, and I descended toward the lobby with a sense of cosmic justice that felt almost too perfect to be real. Phase 1 was complete, and Tyler was beginning to understand that his supposedly brilliant business maneuver had created problems he hadn't anticipated. But the lease violation was only the first domino in a much larger cascade of consequences that would systematically destroy everything Tyler thought he'd gained. As Sophia Reyes, I had resources and connections that extended far beyond building ownership, and I intended to use every available tool to ensure that Tyler's betrayal would cost him far more than he'd ever imagined possible. The lobby was bustling with late-morning activity as I exited the elevator, and I noticed several familiar faces from other companies in the building. Word about Tyler's public humiliation was already spreading through the professional community, and by the end of the day, every major business leader in downtown Seattle would know that Camden Innovations was facing eviction for fraudulent business practices. I walked to my car with the measured pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, which was technically true since my most important work for the day was already complete. But as I drove toward my next destination, I reflected on how Tyler's arrogance had blinded him to the most basic principle of business warfare. Never attack someone without understanding the full scope of their resources and connections. The offices of Morrison, Kim and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of another downtown high-rise, and Patricia Wong had arranged for me to meet with senior partner Elizabeth Morrison to discuss the broader legal implications of Tyler's theft of intellectual property. Unlike the building management case, which was relatively straightforward contract law, the question of who owned the creative work and proprietary systems developed during our partnership would require more sophisticated legal analysis. Elizabeth Morrison was exactly the kind of attorney I needed. Brilliant, ruthless, and experienced in high-stakes business disputes involving intellectual property theft. Her corner office overlooked Puget Sound, and her law degree from Harvard was prominently displayed alongside awards for legal excellence and community service. Miss Reyes, Elizabeth said as we settled into leather chairs around a small conference table, Patricia has briefed me on the basic situation, but I'd like to understand the full scope of your intellectual property claims and the evidence you have to support them. I opened my laptop and began showing Elizabeth the comprehensive documentation I'd been collecting for months, without realizing how valuable it would become. Email threads where I developed creative concepts and technical solutions, time-stamped file modifications showing my work on proprietary software systems, client communications that clearly identified me as the primary creative contact, and detailed project notes that demonstrated my role in every major success Nexus Digital had achieved. This is remarkably thorough documentation, Elizabeth observed as she reviewed screen captures of my development work on the banking software that Tyler was trying to steal. Most people don't maintain such detailed records of their creative process, which makes intellectual property disputes very difficult to prove. I learned early in my career that documentation is the difference between having great ideas and being able to prove you had them first, I replied. Every concept, every innovation, every technical breakthrough that Tyler is claiming as his own work can be traced back to my research and development through time-stamped files and communication records. Elizabeth nodded approvingly as she continued reviewing the evidence. The challenge in intellectual property law is establishing both creation and ownership. You've clearly established that you created most of the valuable assets that Tyler is trying to claim, but the ownership question depends on the employment contracts and partnership agreements you signed when the company was incorporated. I pulled out copies of the incorporation documents that Tyler had prepared, the same papers I'd signed trustingly 3 years ago, without fully understanding their implications. As I reviewed them with legal expertise for the first time, the magnitude of Tyler's deception became even more clear. These contracts are deliberately misleading, Elizabeth said after examining the documents carefully. The language is structured to make it appear that you're signing standard partnership paperwork, but the actual legal effect is to classify you as an independent contractor with limited ownership rights. This kind of deceptive contract drafting could constitute fraud, especially if you can prove that Tyler misrepresented the terms when he asked you to sign. Can I prove that? I asked, though I already suspected the answer based on my memories of Tyler's explanations during the incorporation process. Do you have any written communications where Tyler described these contracts differently than their actual legal effect? Emails, text messages, any documentation where he assured you that you were becoming an equal partner despite signing contractor agreements? I pulled up email threads from 3 years ago, conversations I'd never thought to question at the time because I'd trusted Tyler completely. The evidence was damning. Multiple messages where Tyler had explicitly described the incorporation process as creating an equal partnership, assuring me that the specific contract language was just legal formality required by state business registration requirements. This is textbook contract fraud, Elizabeth said with obvious satisfaction. Tyler deliberately misrepresented the legal effect of these agreements to induce you to sign them. That makes the contracts voidable, which means we can argue that the intellectual property ownership clauses are invalid due to fraudulent inducement. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that Tyler's legal position was far weaker than he realized. It means we can demand that all intellectual property developed during your partnership be distributed according to actual contribution rather than the fraudulent contract terms. Based on your documentation, you appear to have created approximately 70 to 80% of the valuable assets that generate revenue for the company. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who was beginning to appreciate the full scope of the case we could build. Miss Reyes, this isn't just about recovering your fair share of a business partnership. Tyler has committed multiple forms of fraud, theft of intellectual property, and breach of fiduciary duty. We can not only void his ownership claims, but also seek substantial damages for the harm he's caused to your professional reputation and future earning potential. The meeting continued for another hour as we developed a comprehensive legal strategy that would systematically dismantle every aspect of Tyler's theft. Copyright infringement claims for the software systems I'd developed, trademark disputes over company branding that incorporated my design work, breach of contract allegations based on Tyler's violation of partnership obligations, and fraud claims that could result in criminal prosecution if the evidence supported it. But the most devastating weapon in our legal arsenal was something Tyler couldn't have anticipated: the fact that Sophia Reyes had resources that extended far beyond a single real estate investment. Over the past 3 years, I'd built relationships with business leaders, investors, and legal professionals throughout Seattle's commercial community, and those connections provided leverage that could destroy Tyler's reputation even if he somehow survived the immediate legal challenges. As I left Elizabeth Morrison's office with copies of the legal documents we'd prepared, I felt a sense of momentum building that went far beyond personal revenge. Tyler had stolen from me, but he'd also betrayed the trust of clients who believed they were working with an ethical business partner. The Pacific Northwest Bank contract that he thought would establish his independence was about to become the catalyst for his complete professional destruction. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Rivera as I walked toward my car. Miss Reyes, Camden Innovations has requested an emergency meeting with building management this afternoon. Tyler Camden seems quite agitated about the lease violation notice. Should we schedule this meeting, or do you prefer to let the cure period expire without discussion? I smiled as I typed my response. Schedule the meeting for 4 o'clock. I want to hear what Mr. Camden thinks he can offer to resolve his situation. This should be very educational for everyone involved. The afternoon meeting would provide an opportunity to watch Tyler squirm as he tried to negotiate his way out of a legal trap that was closing around him with mathematical precision. But more importantly, it would give me a chance to observe his desperation firsthand, to see how far he was willing to go to save the company he'd stolen from me. Some people learn important lessons about humility and consequences through gentle correction and patient guidance. Others require more dramatic educational experiences that permanently alter their understanding of how the world actually works. Tyler Camden was clearly in the second category, and his education was just beginning. The clock on my dashboard showed 2:30 as I drove toward my next appointment, a meeting that would set the stage for the most devastating phase of Tyler's professional destruction. By the end of the day, he would understand that stealing from Sarah Martinez had been a manageable mistake. But declaring war on Sofia Reyes was a miscalculation that would cost him everything he'd ever worked to achieve. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across downtown Seattle as I prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether Tyler Camden had learned anything from the morning's humiliation, or whether he was still arrogant enough to believe he could manipulate his way out of the consequences of his betrayal. The emergency meeting at Meridian Tower was scheduled for 4 o'clock, but I arrived 30 minutes early to coordinate final details with Marcus Rivera and the legal team. The conference room on the 31st floor had been prepared like a courtroom, with documents organized for maximum impact and seating arrangements designed to emphasize the power dynamics that Tyler was just beginning to understand. Marcus briefed me on the desperate phone calls that Camden Innovations had been making throughout the day, trying to find legal representation that could somehow challenge the lease violation notice. Apparently, Tyler had contacted 6 different law firms, but none were willing to take a case that appeared to involve clear contract violations and potential fraud allegations. He's also been calling other commercial property management companies, Marcus reported, trying to find alternative office space that could accommodate an immediate move. The problem is that news of the lease violations has already spread through the real estate community, and no reputable landlord wants to rent to a business that's facing eviction for fraudulent practices. The irony was perfect. Tyler's public humiliation in the Meridian Tower lobby had created a reputation problem that extended far beyond our building. In Seattle's tight-knit business community, word traveled fast when a company was caught lying to landlords, and commercial property managers routinely shared information about problematic tenants to protect their own interests. At exactly 4 o'clock, Tyler arrived for the meeting accompanied by someone I didn't recognize, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who was obviously a hastily hired attorney with limited experience in commercial real estate law. Tyler himself looked like he'd aged 5 years since the morning, his usual confident demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic and exhaustion. Marcus opened the meeting with formal precision, introducing the building management team and explaining the purpose of the discussion. Mr. Camden, you requested this meeting to address the lease violation notice served this morning. We're here to listen to any proposals you have for curing the documented breaches within the remaining time period. Tyler's attorney, who introduced himself as Robert Nash from a small general practice firm, attempted to take control of the discussion. My client believes there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about the business structure and partnership requirements outlined in the lease agreement. Camden Innovations is prepared to provide documentation that clarifies the actual ownership and operational arrangements. Patricia Wong, representing the building's legal interests, responded with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed complete dismissal. Mr. Nash, we've thoroughly reviewed all relevant documentation, including the incorporation papers, partnership agreements, and employment contracts that establish the business structure. The lease violation is based on factual changes to the partnership that are not disputed by your client. Tyler leaned forward desperately, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of potential eviction. Look, there has to be a way to resolve this misunderstanding. Sarah Martinez was never a true partner in the business operations. She was a talented contractor who provided creative services, but I always maintained operational control and financial responsibility for the company. Marcus maintained his neutral expression while delivering the response that would shatter Tyler's remaining illusions about his negotiating position. Mr. Camden, the lease agreement specifically requires both Tyler Camden and Sarah Martinez to maintain active involvement in business operations. The language is unambiguous, and your termination of Ms. Martinez constitutes a material breach regardless of your interpretation of her role. But what if Sarah came back? Tyler asked, his voice cracking with desperation. What if we restructured the arrangement to comply with the lease requirements? I'm sure we could work out an agreement that satisfies everyone's concerns. The question hung in the air, like a lifeline that Tyler was grasping for in his moment of panic. Patricia Wong exchanged glances with Marcus before responding with deliberate care. Any resolution would require Ms. Martinez's voluntary agreement to return to her previous position with full restoration of her partnership rights and responsibilities. Additionally, Camden Innovations would need to cure all other lease violations, including the unauthorized business name change and misrepresentation of company ownership to clients and vendors. Tyler's face went pale as he processed the implications of what was being demanded. Restoring my partnership rights would mean acknowledging that his theft of intellectual property and fraudulent client communications were illegal. It would mean admitting that everything he'd told clients about company ownership was false. Most importantly, it would mean surrendering the control he'd worked so hard to steal. "That's not possible," Tyler said quietly, his voice barely audible in the conference room. The business restructuring was necessary for operational efficiency and client relations. Reverting to the previous arrangement would undermine months of strategic planning and damage our professional credibility. Marcus nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had just heard exactly what he'd expected. "In that case, Mr. Camden, Camden Innovations, has approximately 18 hours remaining to vacate the premises before we initiate formal eviction proceedings. All security deposits and prepaid rent will be forfeited as specified in the lease agreement." Tyler's attorney made one last desperate attempt to negotiate. Surely there's some alternative arrangement that could satisfy the lease requirements without completely disrupting my client's business operations. Perhaps a payment arrangement or additional security deposit could address the building management's concerns. Patricia Wong's response was final and absolute. "Mr. Nash, this isn't a financial issue that can be resolved through additional payments. The lease violations involve fundamental misrepresentation of business structure and breach of partnership requirements. The only acceptable cure is full compliance with the original agreement terms, which your client has indicated is not possible." As the meeting concluded, Tyler sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his stubborn refusal to accept consequences. In less than 24 hours, he would lose the office space, the business infrastructure, and the professional credibility that he'd thought were permanently secured through his betrayal of our partnership. But Tyler's education in the cost of underestimating people was far from complete. The lease violation was just the first wave of consequences that would systematically destroy everything he'd stolen from me. As Sophia Reyes, I had resources and connections that extended throughout Seattle's business community, and I intended to use every available tool to ensure that Tyler's professional destruction was both complete and permanent. The elevator doors closed behind Tyler and his attorney as they left the building in defeat, their emergency meeting having accomplished nothing except to confirm that Camden Innovations would be homeless within 18 hours. But as I watched them disappear into the lobby crowd, I felt no satisfaction, only cold determination to complete the justice that Tyler's betrayal had made necessary. My phone buzzed with a text message from Elizabeth Morrison. "Pacific Northwest Bank has agreed to meet tomorrow morning to discuss the intellectual property irregularities in the Camden Innovations contract. Apparently, news of the lease violations has reached their executive team, and they're concerned about potential legal exposure." Perfect timing. The domino effect was beginning to accelerate, and Tyler would soon discover that losing his office space was the least of his problems. When the bank terminated his stolen contract, he would lose not only his biggest source of revenue, but also his credibility with every other potential client in the financial services industry. I drove home through the Seattle evening traffic with the windows down, letting the cool air clear my head as I prepared for the final phase of Tyler's professional destruction. Tomorrow would bring new revelations about the scope of his fraud and the consequences of betraying someone who had trusted him completely. But tonight, Tyler Camden would sit in his soon-to-be former office, surrounded by the infrastructure and client relationships he'd thought he could steal, finally beginning to understand that some victories are too expensive to survive. The game was almost over, and Tyler was running out of pieces to play. The morning of Tyler's final reckoning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made downtown Seattle look like a postcard advertisement for Pacific Northwest living. I positioned myself in the Pacific Northwest Bank's executive conference room at precisely 9:30, 30 minutes before the meeting that would destroy the last pillar supporting Tyler's stolen empire. The bank's headquarters occupied 4 floors of the Columbia Center, and their executive conference room offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. Elizabeth Morrison sat beside me reviewing the final documents that would prove Tyler's theft of intellectual property, while across the mahogany table, 3 of Pacific Northwest Bank's senior executives prepared to learn that their most promising new vendor was actually a fraud who had stolen the very innovations they were paying him to implement. Rebecca Chen, the bank's chief technology officer, had specifically requested this emergency meeting after learning about Camden Innovations' lease violations and the questions surrounding Tyler's actual ownership of the proprietary software systems they were licensing. The door opened at exactly 10 o'clock, and Tyler entered with the haunted expression of someone who had spent the previous night discovering that his professional world was collapsing faster than he could comprehend. He was accompanied by Robert Nash, the same inadequate attorney who had failed so spectacularly at yesterday's building management meeting, and a woman I didn't recognize who carried herself with the nervous energy of a crisis management consultant. Tyler's eyes met mine across the conference table, and I saw the exact moment when he realized that his former partner was somehow involved in the meeting that would determine his company's survival. His face cycled through confusion, recognition, and growing horror as he began to understand that Sarah Martinez wasn't just a betrayed business partner seeking personal revenge, but someone with resources and connections that extended far beyond his limited understanding of Seattle's business community. Ms. Chen began the meeting with the kind of professional directness that characterized successful technology executives. Mr. Camden, we've requested this meeting to address serious concerns about the intellectual property rights underlying our software licensing agreement with Camden Innovations. Recent information has come to our attention suggesting that the proprietary systems we're licensing may not be legally owned by your company. Tyler's crisis management consultant, who introduced herself as Diana Walsh, attempted to take control of the narrative before Tyler could respond. Pacific Northwest Bank, we understand there have been some personnel changes at Camden Innovations that may have created confusion about project ownership and development history. We're here to provide complete transparency about the company's intellectual property portfolio and to address any concerns about our licensing agreements. Elizabeth Morrison opened her laptop and connected it to the conference room's presentation system, displaying the first piece of evidence that would systematically demolish Tyler's claims to ownership of the software systems Pacific Northwest Bank was paying him to implement. The screen showed detailed development logs, time-stamped file modifications, and email communications that clearly established my role as the primary creator of every major innovation Camden Innovations was licensing. Rebecca Chen leaned forward with obvious interest as Elizabeth walked through the documentation. These development logs show that Sarah Martinez created the core banking integration protocols that form the foundation of your software system. The timestamps indicate that she developed these innovations over a period of 18 months, with minimal input from Mr. Camden during the critical development phases. Tyler tried to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation. Sarah was working under my direction as a contractor. The intellectual property she developed using company resources belongs to Camden Innovations according to her employment agreement. Elizabeth's smile was sharp and professional as she advanced to the next section of evidence. Mr. Camden, we've reviewed the employment contracts you're referencing, and they appear to contain fraudulent misrepresentations about the nature of the business relationship. These contracts were signed under false pretenses, which makes their intellectual property clauses legally invalid. The presentation continued with devastating precision, showing email threads where Tyler had explicitly described our business relationship as an equal partnership, while simultaneously having me sign contractor agreements that would strip me of ownership rights. The contrast between his verbal assurances and the actual legal documents created an irrefutable case of contract fraud that would void any claims to my intellectual property. Rebecca Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as she reviewed the evidence. Mr. Camden, these communications suggest that you deliberately misrepresented the terms of Ms. Martinez's employment in order to secure her agreement to unfavorable contract terms. This kind of deceptive practice raises significant questions about your company's business ethics and legal compliance. But the most damaging revelation was yet to come. Elizabeth activated a new section of the presentation showing detailed analysis of the software systems that Pacific Northwest Bank was currently implementing. Side-by-side code comparisons demonstrated that the banking integration protocols Tyler was licensing were virtually identical to proprietary systems I had developed years earlier for other clients, systems that he had no legal right to use or distribute. Diana Walsh made a desperate attempt to minimize the implications of what the bank executives were seeing. Even if there were irregularities in the original employment agreements, Camden Innovations has made substantial improvements and modifications to any pre-existing systems. The software you're licensing represents significant additional development work that justifies our intellectual property claims. Elizabeth's response destroyed that argument with surgical precision. Ms. Walsh, our analysis shows that Camden Innovations has made cosmetic modifications to Ms. Martinez's original systems, primarily changing variable names and user interface elements, while leaving the core functionality completely unchanged. This constitutes copyright infringement rather than legitimate software development. Tyler finally found his voice, though it emerged as a desperate whisper that carried clearly in the silent conference room. Rebecca, you have to understand that this is a personal vendetta by a disgruntled employee who's trying to destroy my company out of spite. Sarah Martinez was terminated for cause, and now she's making false claims about intellectual property ownership to sabotage our business relationship. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt the moment had arrived to reveal the full scope of Tyler's miscalculation. I stood slowly, meeting his eyes across the mahogany table with the calm confidence that comes from holding absolute power over someone who has underestimated you completely. Tyler, I said, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal, there's something you don't understand about who you're really dealing with. Rebecca Chen looked between Tyler and me with growing confusion, clearly sensing that this confrontation involved dynamics she hadn't been briefed about. I'm not just Sarah Martinez, former creative director of Nexus Digital Solutions, I continued, watching Tyler's face as comprehension began to dawn. I'm also Sophia Reyes, the property investor who owns Meridian Tower, the building that houses your office space. I'm the landlord who served you with lease violation notices, and I'm the one who's been systematically documenting your theft of intellectual property for the past 3 years. The silence that followed my revelation was absolute. Tyler's face went white as he processed the full implications of what I'd just told him, while Rebecca Chen and her colleagues exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the true scope of the fraud they'd nearly become involved with. You own the building, Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible. You've been my landlord this entire time. The real estate investments, the property management company, it was all you. Elizabeth Morrison seized the moment to drive home the devastating reality of Tyler's situation. Mr. Camden, when you decided to steal Miss Martinez's intellectual property and terminate her from the company she helped build, you unknowingly declared war on someone with resources and connections throughout Seattle's commercial real estate and technology communities. Your former partner wasn't a powerless victim you could discard. She was a successful property investor with the means to destroy everything you thought you'd stolen. Diana Walsh made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of Tyler's professional reputation. Surely we can negotiate some kind of licensing arrangement that recognizes Ms. Martinez's contributions while allowing Camden Innovations to fulfill its existing contractual obligations. Pacific Northwest Bank shouldn't have to suffer because of partnership disputes that occurred after our agreement was signed. Rebecca Chen's response was swift and final. Ms. Walsh, Pacific Northwest Bank cannot continue a licensing relationship with a company that has obtained intellectual property through fraudulent means. We're terminating our agreement with Camden Innovations immediately and will be seeking full refund of all payments made under the invalid contract. Tyler slumped in his chair as if he'd been physically struck, the reality of his complete professional destruction finally penetrating his stubborn refusal to accept consequences. The Pacific Northwest Bank contract had been worth $2.8 million over 3 years, money that he'd counted on to establish Camden Innovations as a major player in the enterprise software market. Without that revenue, his company was not only homeless but also bankrupt. But the bank's withdrawal was just the beginning of Tyler's professional annihilation. Word of the intellectual property fraud and contract termination would spread through Seattle's financial services community with the speed of digital communication, making it impossible for Camden Innovations to secure new clients or business partnerships. No bank, credit union, or financial institution would risk their reputation by working with a company that had been caught stealing proprietary software systems. As the meeting concluded, Elizabeth Morrison handed Tyler's attorney a comprehensive package of legal documents that would formalize the intellectual property claims and initiate civil proceedings for damages related to copyright infringement, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraudulent misrepresentation. The damages we were seeking included not only the profits Camden Innovations had generated using my stolen systems, but also punitive awards that would ensure Tyler's financial destruction was as complete as his professional ruin. Rebecca Chen approached me as the Camden Innovations team prepared to leave in defeat. Ms. Martinez, Pacific Northwest Bank, would be very interested in discussing a direct licensing arrangement for your banking integration protocols. Your systems appear to be significantly more advanced than anything else we've evaluated, and we'd appreciate the opportunity to work with the actual creator rather than someone who stole your innovations. The irony was perfect. Tyler's attempt to steal my biggest accomplishment had directly led to me securing the business relationship he'd thought would establish his independence. Pacific Northwest Bank's endorsement would open doors throughout the financial services industry, creating opportunities that would far exceed anything I could have achieved through our original partnership. Tyler paused at the conference room door, turning back to face me with an expression that combined hatred, desperation, and grudging recognition of his complete defeat. "Sarah," he said, his voice hollow with the exhaustion of someone who had lost everything in less than 48 hours. "I underestimated you. I thought you were just a creative contractor who didn't understand business strategy. I never imagined you had this kind of power." I met his gaze without flinching, feeling no satisfaction in his destruction, but absolute certainty that justice had been served. "Tyler, the mistake you made wasn't underestimating my power. It was believing that betraying someone who trusted you wouldn't have consequences. You stole my life's work, lied to our clients, and tried to destroy my professional reputation. Everything that's happened to you is the direct result of choices you made." As Tyler and his team disappeared into the elevator bank, I remained in the conference room with Elizabeth Morrison and the Pacific Northwest Bank executives, discussing the terms of a new licensing agreement that would be worth significantly more than the contract Tyler had stolen. But beyond the financial benefits, the bank's partnership would establish my credibility as an independent software developer and open doors throughout the enterprise technology market. The next few hours brought a cascade of phone calls and emails as news of Camden Innovations' collapse spread through Seattle's business community. Other companies that had been considering contracts with Tyler's firm immediately withdrew their offers, citing concerns about intellectual property violations and fraudulent business practices. The technology industry's informal network of communication ensured that Tyler's reputation for dishonesty would follow him wherever he tried to rebuild his career. Marcus Rivera called with updates on the building eviction proceedings, which had become a formality since Camden Innovations could no longer afford rent payments without the Pacific Northwest Bank revenue. Tyler had until 6 o'clock that evening to remove all equipment and materials from the 15th floor, after which building security would change the locks and begin preparing the space for new tenants. But the most satisfying call came from Amanda Wells, our former receptionist, who had decided to quit Camden Innovations rather than work for a company built on stolen intellectual property. "Sarah," she said, her voice bright with relief and excitement, "I wanted you to know that most of the technical staff is planning to resign as well. We all knew you were the real talent behind our best projects, and none of us wants to be associated with Tyler's fraud." Amanda's loyalty was touching, but it also presented an interesting opportunity. Over the past 3 years, Sophia Reyes had accumulated enough capital to fund a new technology venture that could employ the talented developers who were abandoning Tyler's sinking ship. Instead of rebuilding Nexus Digital as a partnership with someone I could never trust again, I could establish Martinez Technologies as a company entirely under my control, hiring the best people from our former team, while maintaining complete ownership of all intellectual property. The afternoon brought another pleasant surprise when Harold Kim from Cascade Marketing called to discuss a potential software development contract. Harold had been following the news about Camden Innovations' collapse and was interested in working directly with the person who had actually created the systems his company needed. Sarah Harold said during our phone conversation, "I have to admit that Tyler's claims about developing those banking protocols never quite made sense. I've watched you work on similar projects, and your technical expertise was always obviously superior to his business management skills. I'm relieved to finally have the opportunity to work with the real innovator." By 4 o'clock, I had scheduled meetings with 6 potential clients who wanted to discuss software development projects with Martinez Technologies, a company that existed only in my imagination but would soon become the vehicle for building something far more successful than Nexus Digital had ever been. The betrayal that Tyler thought would destroy my career was actually becoming the catalyst for establishing my independence and professional credibility. But the day's most dramatic moment arrived at exactly 5:30, when Tyler called my cell phone in a final, desperate attempt to negotiate some kind of arrangement that might salvage something from the wreckage of his professional life. His voice was hoarse with exhaustion and defeat as he spoke, each word carrying the weight of someone who had finally understood the full scope of his miscalculation. "Sarah," Tyler began, his usual confidence completely absent, "I know I made terrible mistakes, and I know you have every right to hate me. But I'm calling to ask if there's any way we can work out an arrangement that doesn't completely destroy everything we built together. The patents, the client relationships, the technical systems we developed, surely they're worth preserving even if our partnership can't be repaired." I listened to his plea with the detached interest of someone observing a natural disaster from a safe distance. Tyler was offering to negotiate the return of intellectual property he'd never legally owned, proposing to share client relationships he'd damaged through his fraud, and suggesting we preserve systems he'd stolen and corrupted. The irony was so complete it was almost amusing. "Tyler?" I replied, my voice calm despite the anger that still burned beneath the surface. "You're asking me to save you from consequences that you created through your own choices. You stole my work, lied to our clients, and tried to destroy my professional reputation. The fact that your plan backfired doesn't create any obligation for me to help you recover from your mistakes." "But what about the employees who are losing their jobs?" Tyler asked, playing his last desperate card. "Amanda, the developers, the support staff, they're innocent victims of this conflict between us. Surely you don't want them to suffer because of decisions I made." The manipulation was transparent but also irrelevant. Tyler was trying to use other people's welfare to guilt me into preserving the company he'd stolen, but his concern for employee welfare was purely strategic rather than genuine. If he truly cared about their futures, he wouldn't have built his business plan on fraud and theft. "Tyler, the employees you're so concerned about have already made their own decisions about working for Camden Innovations. Most of them are resigning because they don't want to be associated with a company built on stolen intellectual property. As for their future employment, Martinez Technologies will be hiring experienced developers very soon, and I'll make sure the best people from our former team have opportunities to continue their careers." The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute, as Tyler processed the reality that I was not only destroying his company, but also preparing to hire away his most valuable employees. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the hollow tone of someone who had accepted complete defeat. "You've won, Sarah. You've destroyed everything I tried to build, and you've positioned yourself to succeed where I failed. I hope the revenge was worth it." His attempt to portray my actions as petty vindictiveness rather than justice revealed that Tyler still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what he'd done wrong. "Tyler, this was never about revenge," I replied firmly. "This was about consequences. You committed fraud, theft, and breach of fiduciary duty. Everything that's happened to you is the direct result of your own illegal and unethical behavior. If you'd honored our partnership and treated me with respect, none of this would have been necessary." The call ended without further conversation, and I knew it was the last time Tyler Camden and I would ever speak as anything other than opposing parties in legal proceedings. His attempt to steal my life's work had not only failed completely, but had actually provided me with the motivation and resources to build something far more successful than our original partnership could ever have achieved. As evening settled over downtown Seattle, I stood in the lobby of Meridian Tower, watching the building's security team escort Tyler and his remaining supporters out of the 15th floor for the final time. The office space that had housed Nexus Digital Solutions and briefly Camden Innovations was now empty, waiting for new tenants who would pay rent to Sophia Reyes, while building their own dreams of entrepreneurial success. The sight of Tyler carrying a cardboard box of personal belongings toward the exit was both satisfying and sobering. 3 days ago, he had stood in this same lobby accepting lease violation papers with the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he had successfully outmaneuvered a naive business partner. Tonight, he was leaving as a professional pariah whose reputation for dishonesty would follow him throughout his career. But my focus was already shifting toward the future, rather than dwelling on Tyler's destruction. Martinez Technologies would officially launch next week with a client roster that included Pacific Northwest Bank, Cascade Marketing, and 4 other companies that wanted to work with the actual creator of the software systems they needed. The betrayal that Tyler thought would end my career was actually becoming the foundation for something far more successful and satisfying than our partnership had ever been. 6 months later, Martinez Technologies occupied the entire 20th floor of Meridian Tower, employing 15 developers and generating monthly revenue that exceeded anything Nexus Digital had ever achieved. Amanda Wells had accepted the position of operations manager, while 3 of our former technical staff had become senior developers working on cutting-edge financial software that would revolutionize how banks managed customer relationships. Tyler Camden had disappeared from Seattle's technology community entirely, his reputation so thoroughly destroyed that he couldn't secure employment with any reputable company in the Pacific Northwest. According to mutual acquaintances, he had moved to Phoenix and was working as a junior systems analyst for a small accounting firm, earning less in a year than he used to make in a single month during his brief tenure as CEO of Camden Innovations. The legal proceedings Elizabeth Morrison had initiated resulted in a substantial monetary judgment that ensured Tyler would be financially responsible for the damages his theft had caused for years to come. But more importantly, the intellectual property rights were permanently and unambiguously established, protecting my innovations from any future attempts at misappropriation. Rebecca Chin from Pacific Northwest Bank had become not only a client, but also a friend and professional mentor, introducing me to other technology executives throughout the financial services industry. The reputation I'd built through honest work and innovative solutions opened doors that would have been impossible to access through Tyler's approach of fraud and manipulation. As I sat in my corner office overlooking Elliott Bay, reviewing proposals from 3 new clients who wanted to license my latest banking integration protocols, I reflected on the strange way that life sometimes provides justice when you least expect it. Tyler's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had also freed me from a partnership that was limiting my potential and preventing me from building something truly meaningful. The woman who had been locked out of her own office 18 months ago was now a successful technology entrepreneur with resources and influence throughout Seattle's business community. The intellectual property that Tyler had tried to steal was generating revenue that exceeded his wildest projections, while the company he'd destroyed through his greed and dishonesty was remembered only as a cautionary tale about the consequences of betraying business partners. Some people learn important lessons about integrity and consequences through gentle guidance and patient mentoring. Others require more dramatic educational experiences that permanently alter their understanding of how the world actually works. Tyler Camden had clearly been in the second category, and his education had been both thorough and expensive. But the most valuable lesson I'd learned through this experience wasn't about revenge or justice, but about the importance of recognizing your own worth and refusing to accept treatment that diminishes your value. For too long, I'd allowed Tyler to position himself as the business strategist while I focused on technical innovation, never realizing that my contributions were not only more valuable but also more fundamental to our success. The secret identity that had protected my real estate investments had also protected me from Tyler's attempts at destruction, providing resources and leverage that transformed his betrayal into an opportunity for unprecedented growth. Sometimes the best defense against people who want to diminish you is simply being more powerful than they realize, with resources and connections that extend far beyond their limited understanding of your capabilities. As the Seattle sunset painted Elliott Bay in shades of gold and crimson, I closed my laptop and prepared to leave the office that I owned completely, built with intellectual property that belonged exclusively to me, and operated by employees who had chosen to work for Martinez Technologies rather than remain loyal to the man who had tried to steal their boss's life work. Tyler Camden had locked me out of an office, not knowing that I owned the entire building. But more importantly, he had tried to steal my professional identity, not realizing that I had the resources and determination to build something far better than anything we could have achieved together. The game was over, and I was the only player left standing. But unlike Tyler's approach to victory, my success was built on innovation, integrity, and honest work, rather than theft and betrayal. That difference would ensure that Martinez Technologies continued growing long after Camden Innovations was forgotten, and that the lessons learned through this experience would guide future decisions with wisdom earned through surviving and thriving, despite someone's attempt to destroy everything I'd worked to build. Justice, it turned out, wasn't about getting revenge on people who wronged you. It was about building something so successful and meaningful that their betrayal became irrelevant, while their own dishonesty ensured they could never achieve anything comparable. Tyler had taught me that lesson more effectively than any business school or mentor ever could, and for that education, I was almost grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.